In the 1970s, I was struck by the injustices of women being denied access to health care, to contraception, and abortion. Also, I was struck by the injustice of the lack of availability of certain modern forms of contraception. I myself had had polio. I got polio the year the vaccine came out, and I know it was a devastating impact for me to have polio. So I really could empathize with these women that I was working with at International Planned Parenthood. And then I was also struck by the injustices of the framing of different approaches to the criminal law on the denial of access to contraception and abortion. At that point, human rights had not surfaced as a vehicle to address these problems. We mostly looked at it through the criminal law lens. But the thought of thinking about how the criminal law should comply with human rights was just emerging. We knew it was wrong. We knew there was some legal instruments that could be used, but the human rights framework really wasn't part of the picture in the 1970s when I worked at International Planned Parenthood. It was more a sense of injustice, and that had yet to be translated into thinking about those justices as violations of human rights. Women's agency, women's autonomy was not a given. And there was the whole idea of free and informed consent was on the agenda, but it wasn't a given. And the idea of free and informed dissent was way off. So the whole idea of agency was just emerging at that time. I distinctly remember the conversation with Nigel Rodley, who was at Amnesty International. He was dealing with prisoners of conscience. And here I was trying to develop a law program, not being a lawyer at the time, at International Planned Parenthood. And it was a service organization. So it was very hard for Nigel to understand, working on prisoners of conscience, civil and political rights, for him to think about the social justice dimensions of healthcare. So, but what was wonderful about that conversation, he was incredibly supportive. Oh, there's some real issues here. Oh, yes, I never thought about that. Oh, yes, let's be in touch. I think it's important to stress that the idea of reproductive health was way off. In the 70s, we were thinking of family planning, we were thinking of abortion, we were thinking of voluntary sterilization, and these were very distinct fields. And so you didn't have a comprehensive approach that you now have to this field. The other very important thing about maternal mortality, and there was a WHO definition, death to women while pregnant or within 42 days of pregnancy. So it could be due to unsafe abortion, it could be due to complications during pregnancy, it could be during childbirth, it could be lack of postpartum care. And Deborah and Dr. Rosenfield and a whole group of people at the Family Planning and Population Program were trying to figure out how to spend money most effectively. And so they were pumping out articles, had arguments about this and that. And then there was also very important clinical research being done. Well, why were women dying in childbirth? Was it hemorrhage? Was it high blood pressure? So there was all that medical research. And I, as a lawyer, really couldn't contribute to that. but I knew there was a gendered element to it. And so I looked at the issue of women needing the authorization of their husbands to access family planning or abortion. And at the time, there was no consensus on that issue. They thought, oh, yes, it's women should have the approval of their husbands to access contraception. But this didn't seem right to me. So Deborah and I did an article in the American Journal of Public Health on this issue of spousal veto, which was bringing the two fields together of human rights and of family planning. But I knew there was more to this than just health and human rights and applying the health and discrimination provisions of some of these treaties. I knew that we had to articulate the gender dimensions much more clearly. I'm thinking of Aline, the 2011 case where there was discrimination against an Afro-Brazilian poor woman. That case was brought by the Center for Reproductive Rights. And at that point, there wasn't a well-trodden path of asking for amicus briefs. It was in the early days of the communication procedure. So the Center for Reproductive Rights brought that case and drove it. Where I was involved in that case, in that decision, was in the aftermath, in writing about it, and talking about its importance and why it was so important. And one of the important lessons learned from the Aline de Silva Pimentel Teixeira case was that without the WHO guidelines on emergency obstetric care, it would have been a far more difficult case to bring. And the Aline decision, in some way, well, not in some ways, that decision legitimated and legalized those WHO standards. In other areas of international lawmaking, particularly in the area of trade, you see tribunals legitimizing standards that are developed internationally. And that technique was brought in to women's health by the Aline decision. I think that when you look back, one of the real challenges of trying to develop norms in the context of the health system, whether it's at the health systems level or underlying social determinants, was that the health field, the field of women's health, was really primarily focused on developing standards. They were really trying to figure out how to spend those scarce health dollars, whether it was on emergency obstetric care, whether it was spacing of children, childbirth. So they were really, really focused on standard setting. And they really weren't looking, although very, very aware of the subordinate, that how ill health was predominantly a problem in the lower socioeconomic classes. They really thought that if they could develop the standards for system-wide standards, that would begin to solve the problem. They hadn't started focusing on the particular challenges of subgroups of women. And that's another reason why Aline was so important, because it was dealing with poor, Black, Afro-Brazilian women that really had a focus on Afro-Brazilian, poor Afro-Brazilian women. And that began to shift the conversation towards thinking about intersectional discrimination.